How's it going, everybody? It's Juansgalt with Crypto TV, and this is part 3 of the UASF series I'm doing. I've got Todd, a legend in the space. If you don't know Todd, go follow him on Twitter. Check out his work. He's doing something called Open Timestamps. Very interesting project. We talk about it at the end a little bit. And here he helped me understand an aspect of mining that I had not really kind of gotten that sense of before, which is that it's a commodity industry primarily, and the fork was about miners' expectations as businesses as to what their proper role was compared to what the market actually wanted them to do. So very, very interesting conversation. Tell the world, tell everybody, and like it, share it, subscribe, and enjoy. How's it going?
Good.
Awesome. You got the Dogecoin mic?
Cutest mic ever.
Definitely. How's Parallel Polys going so far?
I'd say pretty good. You know, it's always a fun party. It's interesting in having sort of a bit of a hacker community conference that actually is Bitcoin positive. You know, a lot of them are kind of dubious about cryptocurrencies, especially dubious about Bitcoin. So this is a bit of an exception.
Yeah, definitely. We just got here. It's looking good. I want to talk to you about the UASF event, the whole thing that happened last year. I find that it seems to me like that was a very important moment for Bitcoin. There's a lot of consensus games being played. A lot of, I think it seems to me revealed a lot about the way Bitcoin works. But let's say the social layer, and then there's a bunch of other things that kind of showed up. Do you want to, I mean, I can set up kind of like how it all started, right? We can start from more or less, you know, the moment that we realized we have SegWit 2x, Bitcoin Cash might be a thing, and then 80% of the miners are in theory signaling for UASF for SegWit 2x. How did you see that play out?
You know, it's a hard one because I think it was actually quite complex and kind of had a whole lot of stuff going on at once. I mean, after all, like that was just sort of a long line of requests for doing kind of a hard fork, doing block size increase, having, you know, a on-chain scaling thing, which I think from many miners' point of view is something that they want. You know, they want to be the direct vehicle which transactions happen. You know, Lightning takes away power from miners. Lightning's not giving them visibility. It's not letting them do value-added services. It's just this thing where they become very commoditized. So I think, you know, it's pretty clear to me a lot of miners would not like that. A lot of miners had business plans that were about, you know, saying they were service providers, saying, you know, they had something other than a really dumb commodity business. And I think, you know, around the UASF thing, I think that's kind of where those frictions kind of come into play the strongest. And, you know, UASF is interesting because the victory condition in it, I think, was just saying, hey, these stakes are so high, you should blink first. You know, the last thing you want is a big mess where the UASF promoters are quite happy to walk into that. You know, it isn't something I necessarily want to repeat, but it's good that it showed that, yes, when push comes to shove, there is a power, and you probably should go cooperate more. Because miners at that point were not cooperating.
Yeah, they were not. It was a very intense time, and it felt like a civil war, you know? Like, is that how you felt? Like, you feel like it was like, okay, you gotta...
A metaphorical civil war.
Metaphorical civil war. This is, you know, it's very abstracted.
I mean, I'm going to
war.
Ukraine next. That's a real civil war.
That's a real civil war, yeah. We don't wanna,
it had this sort of metaphorical civil war to it. And I think the really interesting move was probably more Bitmain, creating Bcash.
Yeah, they made a lot of moves. And I was talking with Jay Weatherman yesterday about this as well, and he was pointing out that obviously bigger blocks with SegWit 2x, there were the ASIC Boost bug was still in there, and then there were bigger blocks, and that both in theory benefits big miners, especially Bitmain, because of latency, and they're behind the wall of China, and so they could.
And I mean, ASIC Boost was, you know, such a curveball there because suddenly you find, oh, they actually have this additional reason where they might actually want to block SegWit. That's, you know, deep in the weeds, technical minutia that could have easily been resolved had people raised it, but of course, because Bitmain was probably mining this stuff in secret, not telling their customers, you know, and screwing them over, ultimately. You can easily see why They'd keep it all quiet.
Yeah, and some people have, let's say, people on the other side of the argument have skepticism about ASIC Boost. Do you see it as a legitimate, like it's real, or how real do you think?
Well,
ASIC
I mean,
Boost
what
is?
people specifically do you think have skepticism? What, Emin? Like, I think a lot of people who are raising skepticism about it, the most voracious people pushing this, they're people who just hate Bitcoin Core. They're people who will just come up with anything to criticize. And I think Emin's a good example of that. I mean, he'll literally lie about things to come up with talking points. So
This is Emin Gun.
Emin Gunserer.
Yeah, he's an academic, an American academic from
from Cornell. Yeah, he's a pretty shady guy.
What do you think motivates someone like Emin?
Well, I think the motivation first comes from not being competent enough to generate real innovations. And if you're not in that position, well, what are you going to do next? The obvious thing to do next is either go around Bitcoin conferences giving interviews with highly respected journalists like yourself.
Thank you. Yes.
Which doesn't make you a lot of money.
No, not much money.
Or, you start things like research foundations and so on, and then you lie about what you're doing, and you lie about the other side. And when you do that, well, your funders, the people actually then giving you money for these things, can't tell the difference. And that's how you present yourself as being a legit alternative rather than some guy who'd probably be a reasonable teacher but isn't actually creating new things.
Well, that's exciting. Let's get back to UASF. Okay, so Bitmain obviously was a major player there, but you mentioned something that intrigued me, which was the business models that miners may have had in mind in the future as service providers. Could you give us more examples about that? I've never heard that perspective before. It makes a lot of sense.
Oh, I mean, the most crazy one is actually Bitfury, and they've kind of often been on our side. But I remember once, this was quite a few years back. It doesn't necessarily mean their business model is this now. I remember once in New York going to a little conference by them where they actually brought Jeff Garzik of all people in to go talk about the Bitfury transaction processing vision and how they'd be kind of partners and people pushing Bitcoin transactions and crypto transactions, and none of it really made any sense. It was just all gobbledygook. And Jeff did a great job of presenting a bunch of gobbledygook, but the reason why it doesn't make any sense is, I, as a Bitcoin user, or even I as a cryptocurrency user in general, why would I want, you as a miner to have any say in what I'm doing? I can write software that handles all the part of transaction processing and leaves actual bit of mining to be a completely commodity thing. It's like asking, all right, it's like having a restaurant and having your water company try to become a real partner in your restaurant. I'm sorry, you're just providing water. All I care is that it's clean, it's chlorinated, and it comes out at a strong enough pressure. There's nothing interesting about that business. There's nothing interesting about the mining business. You shouldn't be a partner. You should just be a really boring service provider that's on an invoice at line 300. And you should just do the same thing as everyone else and have the lowest possible price. Yeah. All the interesting stuff should be done in software, not in some weird business partnership. And, if you're a miner trying to raise money, trying to get money from investors, that's not a good story. Investors hate when they hear the word commodity, because commodity doesn't means low profit margins.
Wow, that's fascinating. That explains a lot to me about the market sort of conflict that was happening there. That's definitely very interesting. Jay Weatherman was saying something like that as well. That mining is a really boring job, and it's a very highly competitive job, and there's very little. Basically no room to do competitive edges, which is where ASIC Boost becomes such a dramatic thing. Yeah.
I'll point out there is an exception to the competitive edges, which is exploiting niche opportunities to get energy at cheap prices.
Right.
Yeah, the sort of standard example that people like to do is, you run a greenhouse. Greenhouses in cold climates need a source of heat. How do you get the source of heat? One way is just put Bitcoin miners there. But that doesn't scale. Your opportunity is only as big as your greenhouse, or your chain of greenhouses. It's not like I can come in and say, well, I'm going to provide this really complex thing that no one else can. Rather, it's, I have this business. I'll exploit mining to make my business a bit better. But I'm not a miner. I'm a greenhouse operator that's using this clever technique to get cheaper heat.
Yeah, absolutely. yeah, electricity costs and jurisdictional arbitrage and stuff. Like Venezuela, you just get
Absolutely.
subsidized, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, and I can't, as a Western capitalist, if you will, get investment money to go and help Venezuelans. The logistics just don't work. The legalities just don't work.
right. So the scale of mining in Venezuela is going to be basically nobody in the Western world can actually go and legally invest. They got to go.
Yeah. It's just not something that your standard Silicon Valley person can do.
Right.
Maybe if I had connections, I could, but this wouldn't be an opportunity where I'd be, raising money on, a major exchange, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. UASF was very interesting because there was sort of a potential for a very chaotic time depending on how things played out. So the scenarios I understand there would be, let's say SegWit 2x actually had kept the majority hashing power, which was really funny. Like, they just basically folded the day before. They were like, okay, we'll give you 12 hours of mining at best. And Jeff Garcia was like, never mind. And then somebody else implemented the code, and there was a bug, and it became a sort of kind of embarrassment, right?
I'm pretty sure you got one or two facts wrong in that, but whatever, it was a mess.
Details, okay, well that's good. 'Cause I want to get I would like to do like a deeper historical sort of review of this, but I'm getting kind of like sort of the.
To be honest, like how exactly that played out is complex enough. It's the sort of thing where you kind of go back to notes and remind yourself.
Yeah.
And a whole lot of weird stuff happened, like that bug where the SegWit 2x implementation that Jeff Garzik was supposedly working on just fell flat on day zero, really. And I think what the bigger picture there is, it just shows that the people pushing this were not competent. They aren't people who are very serious. They're not hiring reasonable developers. They're getting the dregs of people who were willing to do it because they couldn't get another job. And it's just kind of sad.
Yeah. Well, I talked about a lot of the different attack vectors with Jay Weatherman, so maybe that can be a reference point for this podcast and this particular conversation. Let's talk about the sort of what might have happened if, let's say, SegWit 2x had the majority of hashing power after the flag date, which was August 1st or August 31st?
First, if I remember correctly.
1st of August, right? Yeah. And so let's assume that SegWit 2x had majority hashing power in a significant, maybe a large minority or a significant amount of.
Well, I think the thing to remember is that hashing power doesn't matter that much in this scenario. The real question asked is, well, what were major economic actors doing? What version of Bitcoin was, say, Coinbase running? What version of Bitcoin were the Electrum, server operators running? What version of Bitcoin? I mean, I guess it didn't exist at the time, but it would be like what version of Bitcoin were various Lightning wallets using? A bit later. I mean, those are the kind of questions that actually matter. And also, what were exchanges doing? I mean, did an exchange say, all right, obviously there's a split. Here, we'll go let you trade SegWit 2x coin, which has this massive, massive risk that the design of it, could essentially get wiped out if people aren't interested in it.
So as a business, like as a blockchain.info, as a Coinbase, you look at this decision, let's say, they're the biggest, right? Or some of the biggest. You look at this decision of which code base to support, and how does that decision happen? Like,
well, I think often the decision would actually be, well, let's do two, because when you do two, you can trade between them and we'll make a ton of money on fees. Right. I think like Bitfinex kind of pioneered that line of thinking. Certainly. When they realized, well, why don't we offer futures for this? If I remember correctly, it was I think SegWit 2x futures that they offered, or some hard fork futures, effectively saying, well, we'll make money off this. We'll let people trade. We'll let the market decide. And regardless of what choice they go, we're still going to make our money. And it also is useful for the rest of the market by giving such clear information. The value of the non-core futures, the non-Bitcoin futures there, just plummeted.
It plummeted.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like 15% for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very valuable. I'm glad they did that.
And remember that even that 15%, that's in an environment where, for very sort of technical financial reasons, it was very difficult to take advantage of that opportunity. You'd have to lock your money up in Bitfinex, which is a big risk.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, that was one of the critiques for sure of it. That it was added risk. But there was other futures exchanges that had like similar prices. So okay, so the big players like blockchain.info and Coinbase basically get out of the way. They say, okay, you have the options, market decide. And so the next tier of economic nodes would be more civilian grade nodes or smaller companies, right? We had the whole Canadian alliance of Bitcoin companies that were pro UASF, and that was Francis Poloni and
Yeah. And I mean, that stuff's, it's hard to know because how many people would go stick with it? How many people would wind up accepting both? I think the main push there is more that we are willing to make this into a mess. We are willing to go dig our heels down. You, the other side, you're in it for money. Why don't you just do the same thing and just go along with the flow? Yeah. How much money are you really going to make by pushing this stuff? This is all more long-term strategic positioning. In the short run, you'll get wiped out, potentially.
As we saw with Bitmain. Bitmain is more or less dismantled now, right? Like this is, I mean,
not yet. They can get their money back for investors, but yeah, they've had a huge loss on Bcash as far as we know. They've probably lost $1 billion on that. And I think Bitmain didn't necessarily make a bad decision, right? In finance, you take risks. And I think looking at what they knew at the time, it was a reasonable plan to try. What the actual risks are is, of course, hard to know, but it's plausible that they could have made money off that. It went against them, and now they've lost a ton of money.
Yeah, it was fascinating. They tested every level of possible scenarios they could have played for that. Could you explain UASF in a little bit more technical way for those that are not familiar with exactly what it was, and then maybe we can talk about what the bad case scenario would have been.
Well, so the technical nature of it is actually very simple. It's that after a certain block height, SegWit transactions are allowed.
That's it. And then blocks that are above 1 megabyte get rejected. And was that part of...
Well, they were always rejected.
They would always be rejected, right.
Now, remember, SegWit's block size increase, right? Once SegWit transactions are allowed, the actual maximum block size goes up to 4 megabytes.
Yes, that's right.
And you can have a bit of nuance about that, but 4 is, 4 is a reasonable number to go and quote there. But the key thing being is that, of course, you've always rejected oversized blocks because they violate the rules, right? SegWit 2x, as that goes through, well, even ignoring the UAS thing, a ton of people would have their blocks rejected. So it's quite likely, even if SegWit 2x went through, you'd get its own sort of UASF in the sense that people wouldn't go through with it. Right? Like ignoring the SegWit UASF, from the point of view of SegWit 2x players, the people who just stay with Bitcoin as it is are a UASF.
Right, because their 2 megabyte blocks are not being accepted.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and so let's say...
Which helps stack the deck in favor of the SegWit UASF.
Yeah, certainly. But okay, so maybe let's say SegWit 2x had 40% of the hashing power. No, let's say 60% of the hashing power, right? It was like that bad. There was like very little consensus on the mining side. And they were stacking blocks and new transactions were being built on top of SegWit 2x.
Look, you're able to do whatever you want in your own little playground. It's irrelevant to me.
Yeah.
No amount of hashing power will force me to accept your invalid block.
Right. And that would be kind of like, but the network would be, to some degree, like the nervous system of the network would be kind of connected.
Doesn't matter. I mean, in fact, whether or not it was, it just doesn't matter. What matters is, does my node accept your block as valid? And it's not going to, so. And
that brings us back to the... Sure. And so that brings us back to kind of like the recent bug that happened in Bitcoin Core, which is like this sort of inflation bug, right? And it's basically the same thinking, right? Like if your node sees that it's an invalid transaction, it'll just reject it, but you need to have an updated version of it. Yeah.
And point out the political aspect of that's very different, because being able to create money out of thin air is probably not what Bitcoin should allow. It's pretty easy to come to consensus. This is a bad idea.
Yeah, it's going to be a matter of getting attention. Like even if we didn't get that kind of attention, the network would probably deal with it on its own, right? Like just simply.
Well,
some people might get scammed, right? But
enough people were running vulnerable versions of Bitcoin that we certainly would be able to create money out of thin air. But That's not likely to stay that way because people will notice very rapidly,
Right.
and that'll get fixed.
Yeah,
the
a
most
few people will
obvious
get
thing.
scammed, some
Don't let
exchanges,
don't let money get created out of thin air.
Yeah.
It's an obvious.
Yeah,
fix.
somebody's gonna get some fake bitcoins. They'll send it to an exchange. The exchange be like, no.
Well,
this
I
doesn't
mean,
work, and then-
realistically, this probably would have all been fixed within hours.
Right.
You know, because someone would notice, oh, this scam's going on. This is obviously a bad idea. Shut down everything. Fix it. We'll fix it.
Okay, tell us a quick download on Open Timestamps. How is that going? I think it's a great project.
It's chugging along. I'm doing a bunch of work to make it better, make it more. I mean, Open Timestamps is centralized.
Right.
There's a set of servers. You know, everything kind of goes through them, but you can back them up. You know, you can create a parallel copy of all that centralized infrastructure on your own. So that's your kind of backup option. And once you get a timestamp proof that goes back to Bitcoin, you're not trusting any of that. You know, the centralized infrastructure is just there to help you get that timestamp proof. So what I'm working on right now is building better mechanisms to more quickly and more reliably make those backups, make those copies, you know, ensure that you're relying on that centralized infrastructure for a shorter period of time.
And you're trying to create a standard, like a public standard, an open standard.
Yeah, and you know, part of that effort is just a better way to describe the standard. You know, I want to work on the Rust implementation to just better nail down what the standard is, and also I want to, you know, get more use cases out of it. I mean, Bitcoin Core as an example, we started timestamping merge commits.
Stamping what?
Merge commits have now started to get
nice.
timestamped by
That's
some.
good.
And I want to make that process easier for people. So
wonderful. Well, I hope you do very well with that. I think it's a great idea.
yeah, thank you. Thank you.